Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I am with my great friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everyone, this is Chen, your old friend, a cultural historian of medieval Europe and China. Great to be with you all today.
Excellent. As some of you perhaps know, following our channel for a while, the premise of the Versucher is that we're moving through many disciplines, many subjects based on the conversations we have before in the process of this channel. So what you're going to see in this channel is not going to be, as predictable as like a philosophy channel or like a revolutionary psychology channel. Like it's going to be, we're going to move around the topics. Now, most of the time, what we do is that we're going to focus on a specific book or a couple of books or papers that is related to what we think is a continuation of our conversations we've had in this channel. Now, as we want to enter this kind of new phase, a new book, a new topic, we we saw it necessary to rather justify or make sense of our move to this new space based on what we have talked about or based on the questions that have been raised in our past conversations. And after this episode, which is a kind of a connector episode, we're gonna get into character and talk about that book. But we saw it necessary to kind of start with like an sort of an introduction of relevance of what we're going to talk about for the purpose of the Versucha channel. So, Trent, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, just sharing perhaps sort of what I understand about the relationship among different types of episodes that we've been creating. I think the overall, like my relationship with this channel is like it's like intellectual diary. It's like a journal. So at times that we dive into specificities, like close reading a text, connecting different like papers on the same topic. But at times, especially after several months of pause or hiatus, it's important for us to connect those concrete project to the big picture, and that's what we're about to do today. Yes.
Exactly. So, what is going to happen in this next couple of episodes is we can call it like a kind of a switch or a move that started from our discussion on evolutionary psychology to what, as you're going to see, is called a niche construction theory. And the move itself started like beginning of the move was the idea of evolutionary psychology because we saw potential or like there was something relevant about delving into evolutionary biology and seeing how the image of humanity has been changed based on the evolutionary psychologist's approach, or how does the post-Darwinian world could even think about something like human nature or what it means to be a human being, and how this gets into like conflict or like in some ways gets connected to a pre-Darwinian like philosophical tradition, or how someone like Hegel, for instance, understands human nature. So we started talking about evolutionary psychology, and evolutionary psychology brought its own problems and conflicts and interesting questions, and we spent some time with our critical engagement of evolutionary psychology and how evolutionary psychology may not be able to fulfill what it promises to do, and how certain concepts in evolutionary psychology, environment, culture, agency, brain plasticity, all of these get into either an undetermined or under-recognized status. Now, what we're going to do as this kind of a next phase of this conversation is going to be a focus on the concept of niche construction. And niche construction is going to be the focus because niche construction is going to bring forth a lot of those concepts to the foreground and give it a new twist, give it a new view about evolution, history, agency, so on and so forth. So that's just kind of a basic premise of this, and we're going to tell you in a moment what are more like a specific questions that we think started in some ways with the beginning of the channel, but also like were emphasized in our conversation on evolutionary psychology and how those questions now are going to become the central part of our conversation through our intellectual discourse on the niche construction theory. Trent, do you have anything to add to this kind of a rather broad?
Yes, I think I want to comment a little bit about the method of making this a transition, which I think is very similar to what I do in comparative history. As a great comparativist, when Doniger says that when she was selecting her cases, because there are numerous topics out there, a lot of them are similarly relevant to our overarching concern about individual, particular, as well as human, universal, the concept of human nature. But why do we do this? She says she always start with things are at first sight very similar, and here we have a lot of similarities between evolutionary psychology and niche construction. They're both focusing on a evolutionary approach towards the definition of a human being. Yet she also says after identifying such a foundational similarity, she will move on to describing to herself the characteristics and the striking differences between these two. Because this is the moment when she started to provide a more nuanced understanding of the initial instinct, the thing that seems to connect these two. So by highlighting the differences, so that we can have a better understanding of the initial category used, for instance, human nature, as well as evolution, that invite us to juxtapose them in the first place. So I think this and the coming couple of episodes that we're going to help to highlight a certain unique features that this niche construction theory is offering, and we're of the opinion that the descriptive process can help us to like expand and nuance our understanding of the overarching theme of the year, namely human nature.
Excellent. Now, if we want to answer to the question of why niche construction theory, right? Like we can move in all sorts of ways. Like we can move like in many directions from the evolutionary psychology episodes. Is the way that niche construction theory gets connected to more specific questions that have been of our interest, both recently and throughout this intellectual conversation. And broadly speaking, we can think about this in two rough categories of agency and environment. Now, we're going to tell you a little bit about like how we're understanding these concepts or how we're understanding the questions surrounding these concepts. And once we start talking about the niche construction theory, it should become evident how niche construction theory is approaching these concepts and how they might add an interesting layer or complexity to our understanding of what it means to talk about agency and what it means to talk about environment. Now, under the category of agency, there are a number of things that are basically important and interesting for us. One of them is how should we understand agency from an evolutionary perspective? Like if you're thinking of ourselves, human beings, alongside other species as living beings, and if we understand ourselves as living beings thrown in this kind of an evolutionary process, how should we think about agency in this process? Is life itself, is agency a minimal condition for life? Or is minimal agency a minimal condition for life? Or life has nothing to do with agency, life is just its own thing, and agency is like something different? Or maybe we can put it in a little bit different way. Agency might be like an add-on to life, not anything that is fundamentally attached to it. Just like not all organisms have eyes, but like eyes are evolutionarily generated. Is agency something like eyes, or agency is something like basic metabolism, right? And how the answer to this question changes our understanding of when we speak of agency in human beings, what exactly we're talking about, right? And of course, this has a different side. The flip side of the coin is that agency is not an objective state of affairs. Like it's not something that has a deep root in evolutionary process. I mean, you can see that like in evolutionary psychology, for instance, the attitude is a form of determinism that basically thinks of anything that resembles agency as more of a subtle commandment that is like developed throughout like millions of years, more than anything that we can call like agency in any sort of a freedom kind of an agency. In that sense, the order of things might be different. Like we think that, does life equal minimal agency? That's one way to go about this. But another thing is that to think about, oh, basic life doesn't have any agency. Basic life in the form of like bacteria, or like even like I'll do a contested concept like viruses, um, doesn't have any agency, and we are still in that space, right? Like there is no such a thing as agency, and evolutionarily coherent conception of agency, because life is not about agency. And as you're going to see, niche construction theory is going to have a story about agency and what agency does to evolution and what evolution does to agency. Trent?
Yes, based on what you said, one term that I want to perhaps supply or highlight here is the concept of change, because life is both a continuous statement, is a statement of a continuous existence and like supposition proposition. On the other hand, it includes a lot of changes, and I think agency is what you give the example of like eyes and the metabolism. Those are not really present continuously in the sense like an existence for organism is in our conception. Instead, when we are verifying the capacity or the function of these faculties or parts of life, we are really talking about the moments when they manifest or when they are introducing interventions in the course, a specific ordinance and high and is guiding towards. So the concept of putting like agency in evolution, I think it is a really interesting and important question to think about, to connect that continuity or stability on one hand, and those various or changes on the other hand. So how do we define life? Is it just like objective statement? It's a static nature, or is it a process in the sense that we could analyze it's defined by its potentiality, things of that kind. So those are really important terms I think one can introduce by juxtaposing like agency and evolution, as you just did.
Yes. And I think this idea of, I think, potential for change, or I think that's an important concept there. And like this kind of like having the seeds of agency versus having agency, or like having the seeds for change versus some form of predetermined rigidity. And I think this gets related to the second point that is related to agency, and that's the concept of plasticity. Because when we talked about like David J. Buller's criticism of evolutionary psychology, one of the main things that kind of was at the center of the conversation was the fact that like neural plasticity is under recognized in evolutionary psychology, right? Like there is, as human beings, our brains are not just these systems that are, really mini computers, as evolutionary psychologists really love to call it. But there is some sort of an adaptability and plasticity that exists in our brains that itself is an adaptive advantage, is a competitive advantage over like a very rigid brains that might have been around in our evolutionary past. Now, the question is, when we speak of plasticity, and when we speak of plasticity both within organisms or within evolution as a process itself, um, what exactly we're talking about? Because plasticity as a potential for change of input and output could mean some form of meta level disruption to a determined path, right? It could be like this is the path is unfolding, here are the inputs, here are the outputs, and plasticity could mean let's get out of this system and just disrupt it, and then we have new set of inputs and outputs. That's one way to think about plasticity. Um, but plasticity could also be compatible in a certain way with a more like an evolutionary psychology type of image of the world. Well, evolutionary psychologists, remember, think that we have modules. We have psychological modules. Those modules are specialized. We have specialized modules for mating. David J. Buller, in critiques of evolutionary psychology, come and say that no, there is no general problem that could be called mating. These are all mini problems of, identifying a tall person, identifying hierarchy, identifying, whether this or that thing are connected, and so on and so forth. So there cannot be like a predetermined mini computer solving the problem of mating. Fair enough. But why can't we think about plasticity as a very, 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 very large list of predetermined inferential rules, right? Perhaps evolutionary psychologists are very limited in our understanding, in their understanding of what kind of inferences exist, right? But that doesn't mean that plasticity cannot be about predetermined inferences. Plasticity could be about adding, to use evolutionary psychologist language, more mini computers, right? More mini inference machines within a system. And if plasticity, like if we say like human beings have more plasticity than apes, right? One thing that we could mean by that is that human beings have much more agency over themselves than apes, which means that we can kind of like stand above whatever is like naturally given to us, and we can kind of change the order of things. We have that potential. Apes have much less than that, but probably apes have more of that than like, earthworms. But what we might go and see, like the relationship between us and apes is not about we all have more agency, is that we have more mini inference machines within ourselves, right? That would be a very different understanding of plasticity. And this conversation is like that I have started here is not, this is just about organisms and organisms within a species, but I think we can kind of think about this as evolution, like kind of a meta level understanding of evolution, how much plasticity exists in evolution itself, right? Or how much it can be disrupted. How much of a law is it? How much of a, like a law in a very kind of a predetermined is it? Um, and whether this potential for agency is something meaningful within this evolutionary process, and agency just becomes plasticity, vice versa, or these are separate concepts, and even if we have plasticity in nature, we will not have agency. Trey?
Yes, what I hear from what you said just now had like two layers to this dynamic between agency and plasticity. On one hand, there's a concept of a complexity that oftentimes when we recognize plasticity is, we have the same apparatus, but it produce different output or reacts differently if the input varies. And the one there are many ways to go about this. Some people will say, "Oh, this proves that such thing has that decision-making power." Say, individual human beings, the brains. But another way is to kind of deconstruct or providing, in your language, the mini computer model, like those complex input output the correspondence system does not suggest that there's something mystical about the totality of the unity about the whole pattern. Instead, it just shows us, it could be explained at least by the very intricate and complex inferential system, as you nicely put it, that is already in place in this whole thing. We recognize it as unified entity, say human or brain. So the very fact that we can observe empirical correspondence between the various sort of input and output did not directly lead towards the conclusion that there's something called agency in place, or we don't necessarily need this concept to explain such a plasticity. I think that's why you used the question oxymoron in the heading. Another thing I think can open up not just a conversation within natural sciences, based on what you said, but in fact connect natural science with the social science and the humanities in general. It's a concept, for lack of a better term, maybe power, the power dimension of agency, to what extent that we are, say, human beings or society or culture is just like passive recipient of things um, given, determined for them or given to them, or to what extent that we are actually shaping things that are necessary for our existence and flourishing. I think that the other way that agency and plasticity is used in, say, discourses in many different fields. Sometimes we say a system has more agency or an individual has more agency because it seems like that they have wider range of potential outcomes or options given the same input. So plasticity and agency, there's kind of a positive correlations between like the power an entity or an individual assumes and the how to put it, the horizon of possibilities afford to that individual. So those are two terms I heard in your conversation. I think niche construction theory is a great way for us to bring them together and connect them with things that we're other things that we're concerned about.
Definitely. And I think that the point about complexity specifically, I think is very interesting because, as you said, plasticity could be about complexity and not agency. And I think that is something that is important to understand. Like, what does the concept of agency add to the whole story that is not about plasticity? And whether something like niche construction theory could actually address that difference, or it gets tied up in like conflating the two and using them interchangeably without really explaining what that difference is. On the last kind of like round on agency, I think there is this kind of, and you have heard us so far like talking about that too, like this kind of like looming spectra of determinism around all of this. And I think there are a couple of things that are relevant here. And I just mentioned these briefly because I think they deserve to be connected to something concrete in our conversations. Of course, there's this issue of determinism that really kind of undermines any form of agency, right? Like there is a form of like physicalist kind of determinism that may be very much like destructive to any understanding of agency, or any like meaningful objective reality to agency. That of course like there's kind of a tension between that and like maybe kind of a phenomenological experience of a human being, right? Or like how we see like some differences in behavior and capacity between us and like stones. But of course determinism could take many different shapes, and psychological determinism is one version of that, a story, right? That is not necessarily the same as the kind of physicalist determinism. And evolutionary psychologists are psychological determinists to a very good degree, although they don't tell us exactly to what degree, but they seem to be very much in that camp. The layer of uh, determinism, though, that I think it is interesting, and I think it becomes relevant at the stage of the niche construction theory, and it gets related to the whole point about power and like the sociopolitical layers of these topics that we are both very much interested in, is the relevance of individuals, right? Like we have populations, and we have a concept that we use without really explaining much, society, and we have individuals, individuals, organisms, part of the same species, individual human beings, part of the same society, like this type of a relationship. And this has been one of the most pressing issues for all of us, for like all of us, which means both of us, in the sense of individual universal relationship, right? And what kind of relationship we have with like the kind human being versus the individual human beings. Like what is the relationship between the two? And in like using the language of agency, do individuals have any form of agency to really change the kind? And if they have the agency to do that, what kind of agency is that? And what is basically this relationship as some form of a population genetics types of like layer of a species, or even the collective agency of a species versus like an individual? Is the individual merely the recipient of a pre-planned story that it just executes in a specific environment, or an individual has agency to the degree that it can kind of go back and disrupt something about that population or about that society? That's like one layer of that question of determinism that I think is interesting, and it's very much and very directly, I think, gets connected to the niche construction theory. Trent?
Yes. Again, two things I heard, or two ideas that are inspired by what you just said. First is I think one term worth more emphasizing than we so far have done for this whole section about agency is the concept of adaptation, and which is very directly connected with the individual society or individual collective relationship. So in evolutionary theory, that we're talking about, like the debate is about whether a specific population or a species that is adapting actively or passively to the environment, to the changes. Some of the things that for human society, sociologists or anthropologists will debate whether individuals are reacting to cultural social norms that as like active makers or as like passive recipient. Another thing is what I just mentioned on the second point, the concept of power. And I think the nice thing of bringing niche construction or evolutionary biology into the discussion of usually sociological or anthropological discourse about power is when we are doing sociology and anthropology or cultural history in general, we are usually talking about considering power as a way, as a type of intra-species, intra-human phenomenon, like one individual dominance over other individuals, so one system overpowers the other systems. But this helps us to broaden the horizon to look at how, like, through the seemingly intra species or community competition or collaboration, we're actually actively redefining the whole like nature of this kind. So the power in the sense not just within this the whole predetermined space of what does it mean to be a human society, but rather like the boundary of the whole society or the relationship between the society and non-human quote unquote agents or resources that are around us becomes like more fluid than what we would have considered without this framework. Yes.
Yes, I think that yeah, that's a very interesting thing. This is kind of abiotic, biotic, non-human, and human, and how like these types of elements of the environment are gonna be intertwined with that agency or lack of it at the individual level. Which, in fact, like the second kind of like broad category that we are interested in, and we think niche construction theory has a lot to offer in that layer is the concept of environment. Like it is very interesting because environment is very much of like it's used in a casual ways and in academic ways, and it's another concept that doesn't get as much attention. Like there are a lot of like philosophical conversations on the nature of agency. There are less philosophical concepts conversations on the concept of environment, and I think that is as important as understanding the concept of agency. Because when we talk about an environment, what exactly are we talking about? And I think that was, in spite of our uh, comprehensive criticism of evolutionary psychology, I think that was one of the interesting, inspiring, and insightful lessons that I've had from evolutionary psychology, which was actually like problematizing the concept itself. Because sometimes the way that we think about environment is that, like, you know, there are like biological stuff, and environment is just like an environment that is like independent from all of that. And you're thrown into an environment that starts like shaping you as if you're this, you know, clay with no form, and like you're just suddenly created or socially constructed as something, almost putting all the agency to environment, and especially a social environment. But the relationship between the givenness of the environment and the givenness of the biological entities are far more complicated. I remember this like vivid example that evolutionary psychologists brought up, that, you know, like a diet could change an ant into a queen or a worker, but no diet like changes the ant into, like, you know, a guitar player or, you know, evangelical Christian. Like it's not that the environment is just, you're not a clay, basically. You're not like some sort of a random clay that environment could just take and do whatever it wants to you. Um, More importantly, in some ways, environment is pure noise. The very fact that there is any coherent concept of environment is that the organisms have filters to take some layers from the outside world. Otherwise, like from this kind of a view from nowhere kind of a perspective, environment is just mess. It doesn't have any order to it. The order is only relative to the entities that care about something in the environment, or in that noise. They are looking for a signal. They have a way to go about the signal. Now, the question is, though, whether this whole idea of like recipient, um, that we talked about, like whether we're passive recipient in agency, whether that is also like a meaningful thing to talk about in the sense of environment. Because we can say, and this by no means is just about like evolutionary like psychologists, that environment is kind of like determined. Like the environment is there, your genes are there, you go there and you just, you get activated. Some of those genes get activated, and you just turn out to be this individual that you happen to be, right? Um, Interesting enough, like very much like anti-evolutionary psychologists, some form of like social constructionists would give like a radical agency to the environment that in some ways kind of resembles of a similar type of determinism, that the environment is the environment, you just happen to be thrown in it, and the environment will shape you, right? So I think that the point that maybe in a more clear way is that there is this kind of two popular ways to think about environment. Either environment is this independent agent that comes and shapes you, or environment is already like shaped and determined and only activates parts of you, right? It kind of pushes certain buttons and like something happens. In both of these stories, evolution psychologists, a very deterministic social constructionist view, the biological entity that is thrown into an environment doesn't really matter. It either gets activated to be a certain thing, or it fully gets shaped to be a certain thing. And it doesn't have, guess what, any form of agency to build the environment. And the whole premise of the niche construction theory is that organisms shape their environment, and by that change their destiny. And I think this is going to be an interesting tension to bring forward. Are niche constructionists saying something radically different than both evolutionary psychologists and determinist social constructionists? Or in some ways they fall into the same kind of a category, but in a different order, or in a different kind of variation? Trent?
Yes, one important way that environment, the concept of environment and the concept of agents that are always like involved or married in the kind of a scholarship who we're interacting with so far is it seems that the whole different attitude towards that individual universal individual collective relationship is ultimately debate about how to allocate agency. Like some would allocate it within the species themselves, like for instance, the evolutionary psychologists and other strains of theorists who prioritized how individuals or that self actually set the boundary to the kind of influence they could possibly receive from the environment. So environment is sort of influence on individuals that are kind of predetermined by the individual and its nature. The other, you have like social constructionist, as you mentioned, who would say, no, like we could be potentially some kind of malleable metal or clay, and it was really structures that beyond the individuals that are shaping the kind of manifestation and the destiny of the individuals. Which reminds me of kind of a debate that I'm teaching recently about the early Chinese philosophy. Like the two philosophers, the Xunzi and the Mencius, who kind of represent or embody these two positions. Like one would both are trying to explain why they are good individuals and morally bad individuals in the society, even though human nature presumably is the same. And one would say, oh, it's because human nature is intrinsically good, so long we have sufficient resources for an individual to grow, they will end up being good human beings, which is kind of similar to the evolution psychologist viewpoint. We really look into the self of individuals, that we decided it's a nature, and so long as the right resources that this individual is looking for in the environment is present, then this would turn out to be the normal self, namely a good person. But Xunzi would the opponent will argue, no, 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 no. What really matters is like the social condition, it's the ritual code we received from heaven, things of that kind. And human nature actually is like evil or bad. It's only with that the environment's the shaping force, it could become a good person, become a sage. So just throw this in that like this kind of debate is present not just in the contemporary different disciplines, but also in different cultures, different time, and that curiosity about how to allocate agency in this individual versus a collective dynamic that has been with us for a very, very long period of time.
Yeah, and I think the point that you're mentioning just kind of brings out this like the because you're talking about like thinkers talking about morality and talking about environment and what kind of elements of environment may shape or activate or like the moral integrity of a person, which I think it's in some ways it's like what I want to bring forth. The next thing, it gets related to that because all the examples I gave was about natural environment. And you brought up something that is very much kind of a culturally sensitive concept, and I think like there is something about this whole concept of environment that gets related to the concept of history, because it doesn't matter if you're an evolution psychologist or if you're an anti-evolution psychologist. It seems to be the case that there is something to be said about the historical structure of an environment. But two different histories seem to be kind of like the makers of the environment, right? Or the what determines the nature of the environment. One is the natural history, right? And that seems to be for some people like evolutionary psychologists the only thing that matters, right? The environment has been shaped as part of the natural history. The environment has other organisms that have been shaped by evolution. It has abiotic entities that has been shaped by the geological history of the Earth, so on and so forth, right? So like the environment, what matters in the environment ultimately is this historically developed space, and that historical space, perhaps the most important part of it, is the natural layer of it. Why? Because for someone like evolutionary psychologists, human history, or like the quote unquote cultural like creations of humanity, are only express forms of predetermined psychological commands that were given to us because of very specific natural needs, right? So it's more like about decorating the natural environment than really changing the natural environment. Um, so the natural environment has been historically, in the human sense of the word, being decorated. But what matters in that environment is that it is naturally developed historically. And that is like the end of the story, it's the end of the historical relevance of the environment. So like evolutionary psychologists are not going to be interested in global medieval ages insofar as like what it means to be a human being is concerned, because whatever global middle ages is, as opposed to contemporary like Peru, is nothing different. Like it's just like a different decoration, the same environment. That's the environment. Because what matters is natural history, and natural history, insofar as our species go, has been kind of like not petrified but stabilized. And that's it. That's the end of this story. On the other hand, the social constructionists, or whatever you want to call this kind of opposing anti-evolution psychologists, for them, the natural history is irrelevant. What you're thrown into is actually historically situated space in which the cultural history of human beings is the one that needs to really matter. So cultural history becomes important because cultural history is really giving you your immediate environment. We're not only like looking at natural environments, we are in fact always shaped or determined or pushed by um, environments that are created historically and culturally. And for them, the natural aspect is like less relevant. Now, this relationship between natural and cultural history is something that is probably one of the most important parts of our conversations. Like, how should we think about these two? Should we think about them as distinguishable but not distinct? Should we think about them temporally? Should we think about them as in a hierarchical way? Like, how should we kind of think about these two? Um, and it is, of course, interesting. Like the pre-Darwinian philosophers are not even interested in natural history because that doesn't really change anything. So this is something that is like a more of a 20th century, 21st century kind of a problem. And I think this is the niche construction theory has a potential to, if not answer some questions about this, but at least open up like potentials for reframing the relationship between the two. Trent?
Yes, just one thing. I think you did a great job, like summarizing the differences between these two approaches. I think it's important for us to point out there are important similarities or commonalities to which niche construction theory also has a space for. So both types of history concern logic of changes that both whichever camp you belongs to, whichever theory you subscribe to, you acknowledge it. For instance, let's take human example. Human changed, like the way of life changed, and like the height, the strength also changed, like in different place and time. And these two, natural and the cultural history, are basically proposing the most important driving force of regulating behind the regulation of such change. Like natural history would look for such the entity of change in specific domain and culture in other domain. Yet ultimately they are interested in explaining the logic of change. And one more thing they are united is both concede the importance of information transmission or the concept of inheritance in whichever domain they propose to be most important. And I think when we're talking about niche construction, it becomes clear that this is a one attempt among several alternatives to find a way to regulate these multiple, seemingly self-sufficient or independent chains of information transmission. Some are characterized perhaps in layman's language more in the natural domain, some are more in what we call like symbolic cultural domains.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. Yes, I think because as you're going to see this whole idea of information and its relationship to life and evolution of life, it's going to be something central in our conversations in the next couple of episodes. The last point, which I'm going to be quick about it because I think we have already in some ways mentioned, is perhaps one way to think about it is that when does culture begin? Right? Like when we think about culture, like when does it like when we should we start like saying that okay, here is a cultural activity? birds make nests, right? Like, and that is something that, is a classic example of some form of niche construction. They build nests and they teach their, uh, children to build nests. It's not like as simple as that, of course, but like that is something. There is some sort of a transmission there, right? Transmission of like, let's just do this to our environment, right? Now, human beings build churches and tell their children, this is how you build a church, this is why you build a church, so on and so forth. If this is a specific kind of a relationship that we have with our environments, where is the difference, right? Is there a difference between these two? Is there a difference between niche construction in the form of building nests and niche construction in the sense of building churches? And is the difference between these two episodes like just a matter of, again, something like complexity, or it is a complexity of a different domain that we're not even in the same space anymore. We have entered a new space. Just one last thing about this, why I think it is important to make this difference, because there is there is one thing to say that, for instance, there is continuity between non-living beings and living beings, right? If you are if you are part of the paradigm accepting scholars of our time, you would think that there was a time there was no life on planet Earth and life emerged, right? So there's definitely continuity. Whatever life is, it has to be in continuous relationship with the non-life. But it is also rather absurd to just say that that means that life and non-life are just basically just collapsible into the same category, right? Basically, there are things about life that don't seem to be explainable by the same language that is used to describe non-life, according to some, at least, right? So the question that I think that I have here is this the same story about human culture versus like ape culture, right? Like, is this something about like now? This is not just about a more sophisticated communication technique. This is a new like era. This is a new form of being that creates a sharp distinction between itself and its past, the ape past. If that's the case, what is that distinction? If that is not the case, what does that even mean? Right? Like when we say, if we say, like building churches is just equivalent of building nests, what exactly do we mean by that equality equation? Trent?
Yes, I think this very quickly. This is the only item I think on the slide that is touching on one specific aspect that both of us are very interested in. So far, like the previous 5 points that are kind of trying to situate a lot of things like agency, environment, and in kind of not tentative dichotomy like nature versus culture, but the culture is left unspecified, and this one is really, it's like what John Melton's tried to do in parallel laws to account for the dignity of man, so the unique nature of a human existence in contradistinction to other forms of like complex social animals. And one important one to echo what you just mentioned is the mention of complexity. The question is that at which point it becomes necessary for us to maintain certain quantitative like accumulations of differences or capacities have yielded to a qualitative difference. We no longer can put, say, human beings and other social animals in the same platform and use one unifying theory or method to analyze how they like control their environment. Instead, we must separate the two because they're qualitative differences perhaps between human and non-human social animals. I think this one really highlights how to say opens the space that or for us to further differentiate this or complicate this nature culture dichotomy. And both of us believe that the niche construction theory is trying to reserve a space for this sort of a conversation. To what extent our human beings, the niche construction, like culture making invention, could be analyzed as at a pan life level, but in what specific ways it should be set apart from our analysis, from other like life forms and their niche construction activities.
Yes, I think that's definitely a fair point in the sense of when we are thinking about humanity, the how much of our conversation is about human uniqueness, right? Like when we're describing humanity, in a lot of ways, we're kind of putting it in conversation with its past in a natural sense. But could we talk about any sort of a meaningful break or the same kind of a logic that applies to the rest of the animal kingdom? The same logic applies to human beings with no difference. And these are all just different variations on the same theme, and no new kind of tunes are being really introduced. Excellent. I think we are done with our introduction. What we're going to do is that we're just going to jump right in and tell you about a specific book that we have chosen on niche construction. And in our conversation on that book, all of these questions and all of these concerns are going to find their way. Right?
Yes, no more elaboration. Just thank you very much for your attention. Please stay attuned. Our next episode introducing John Aldlin Smith's book, Niche Construction, is coming up.